Hello and welcome to the first proper video on this channel that I'll be putting out, and in this one I'd like to talk over one of my most finished impressions. By impressions in reenactment, we usually refer to a coherent piece of kit that we've put together, and with a lot of different items we brought it together to create a fairly realistic view of what an individual may have looked like in the period. The reason I say fairly realistic is because we can never be 100% realistic with what we're doing. We simply don't know a lot of things about every period. There's always something we'll never know. And it's important in an impression that the status and the culture of the specific individual, even if the period is the same, is also correctly represented. And in this impression, I think that's a very prevalent thing. I will go on to do another video about how I as an individual start researching and planning for an impression, and certainly more on that general topic in even further videos. But for now, I'm just going to talk about this individual impression of mine and explain my own choices with regards to how I did that. This impression that I'm going to be displaying is of an Anglo-Saxon high reeve of the early 11th century, about the year 1000 to 1016. The reason it finishes at 1016 being that that's the time when Canute comes over with his big army and takes over the country, and significant changes occur. Although the fashion wouldn't actually change that much, so my impression is still fairly appropriate for the period after Canute is in power. But with the specific items I've chosen, pre-Canute and in Athelred the Unready's reign is more where I'm focusing. And the thing about Reeves is they were very commonly misunderstood. People get this idea that they were sort of tax collectors, or they were, they had a single role. Especially, for example, I was talking to a friend of mine recently who does late Roman, and he was explaining that in the late Roman Empire, possibly the earlier Roman Empire, I can't remember, but this job that the Reeve has would have been handed over to multiple individuals within society. It would be a whole team of people taking on each role of that of the job that in Anglo-Saxon England was the Reeve's job. It was him, and he was the executor of his own jurisdiction, which is really what comes to what a Reeve is, where the individual Reeve would be responsible for matters in their jurisdiction, mostly legal, and pretty much all of everything that's related to legal matters in their jurisdiction, they were in charge of. So port Reeves, for example, would deal with import and export, taxation, crime and punishment, whereas a Reeve that's in charge of a burh or a wick, a trading marketplace that's happening, would be responsible for matters pertaining to that. Although those two examples, or those three examples, aren't really a high status example of a Reeve's job. They are still of the noble class. They are still responsible for much of the same things. They deal with crime and punishment, taxation, all these really important legal matters, but they are around the Thane level of status. They're sort of captured in that boundary of society where they're still fairly low. They're very, very, very high status compared to, the broad spectrum of people in this period. But as nobles go, they are the bottom rung of the ladder. this is part of that common misconception I spoke about, because people think of Reeves as one rung on that ladder. They're in one position, whereas actually you have Reeves all the way from the the town Reeves, the Burr Reeves, all the way to the high Reeves, and this goes from the very bottom and to the very top of noble society in Anglo-Saxon England, and that's a really important thing to get across. The Reeve I represent is a high Reeve, and as I just mentioned, very, very top of society in comparison to the Wick and the Burr and the Port Reeves, a very, very powerful man. In the Kingdom of England, after its formation in 927, there would only be a handful of high Reeves at once who had this utter authority over their jurisdiction. And the difference between the higher status Reeves and the lower status Reeves is land. How much land do you have control over? A high Reeve, or also known as a shire Reeve, would have control over entire swaths of land, shires, or what we now think of as modern English counties. For example, Cornwall is Cornwall, and Devonshire, which was Devon. And those are actually two counties that have not changed since the original Kingdom of England. And these high Reeves would have utter authority over that jurisdiction. And this transforms in later period in the nomenclature into the sheriff, because it comes from Shire Reeve, which is a Reeve that has jurisdiction over multiple shires. And a good example of this is the Sheriff of Nottingham in the Robin Hood stories, being a very, very powerful man who few could actually oppose. And this is real. This is actually based on how Reeves operated in medieval society. And being a high Reeve, you'd frequently be the chair of a shire court. You'd be the executor of all taxes and all law in that jurisdiction. You essentially have the final say on everything in that boundary. And as a result, a powerful man like that would have a very high status set of kit to go along with it. These status indicators that would be on the kit presented would be a polarizing feature. It would immediately show who this person is. The average peasant knows what a noble looks like, and this is yet another level above that. This is almost the king. This is the highest rungs of these are the highest rungs of Anglo-Saxon society. And so with all that said, here is the image of my impression as of mid last year. It hasn't massively changed since then, although one thing is that just the other day, this lovely, lovely tunic tragically shrunk in the wash. Genuinely, it wasn't cheap, and I will be having to seek a replacement in the future, but unfortunately, such is life. I just have to sort that out. Now, as you can see here, I'd like to point out individual pieces and talk about them. So, I'm wearing deep blue woolen hose. Woolen hose are a staple of Anglo-Saxon clothing in this period. You can see that they are fairly tightly fitted. They're much more tightly fitted in the lower leg than they are in the upper leg, which obviously you can't see because of the leg bindings. The deep blue colour is absolutely achievable in period, but it was incredibly high status. It's an indigo tin dye, also known as indigo, and that would be something rarely seen, to most people. And then the second item is a pair of green leg wraps or Vinningas, which are again of a fairly high status color. This green color. The main misconception that people have seems to be that dull colors are associated with lower status. This may seem a fairly dull color, but to achieve it, it has to be over-dyed multiple times to achieve this almost bottle green look. I'm wearing a pair of spurs. Spurs in this period are an indicator of status. They are not necessarily a practical item being worn for riding. They would be worn for riding, but the spurs primarily were used to show this is a man who does ride. This is a man who has his own horse and has the ability to ride this horse, which was a status indicator all of itself. The straps on it are oxblood, which is a period dye. I will do another video on oxblood in the Viking Age because it's a lot to unpack that would take too much time in this video. I'm also wearing now-binded socks. These aren't necessarily appropriate for an Anglo-Saxon impression. We only have one find of now-binding in the UK, and it is this pair of socks from Coppergate. So if any now-binding is appropriate, it's this. And they are to keep my feet warm, essentially. I've then gone with a pair of fairly simple, low toggled York-style shoes. And I have a dyed linen undertunic. Dyed linen, as you may know, is again incredibly high status in period because it's very, very difficult to dye linen, and a linen tunic would be constantly over-dyed. The other thing I have is this high status herringbone tunic, which, as I mentioned, unfortunately is no longer usable, but it's a very, very fine madder red tunic with blue silk on the facing and the cuffs. Silk is something we start to see coming in more and more on garments in the 11th century. So for the period point, it's a very appropriate choice for the point in time that this impression sits in. I then have a pillbox cap. We don't have any individual evidence for pillbox caps in the 11th century, but as hats go, it's pretty much the best choice, and it has a very, very long pedigree. Then you can see the mammoth ivory seal matrix. The seal matrix on a high reeve was used to sign official documents, even if he didn't write them. When he had a cleric write them for him, he would sign the document to show that he was the one who executed that individual writ, that it was authenticated. And now we get to bling, essentially. I have a silver neck cross, 3 silver rings, 1 copper ring and a bronze ring, and a silver arm ring. These are all used to show status, to show wealth. You are wearing the wealth on you, just as with the silk. And the other thing is a fairly decent replica of the Battersea sword, which is a sword from Battersea in London. It was found in the Thames, and it is an Ulfbert. This one is actually blunt for reenactment fighting, but it is a fairly well detailed version of the original. And obviously, as an Anglo-Saxon in the 11th century, he has his sayax hanging from his belt. This one has Boris-style decoration, which falls off very, very late 10th century. But it's not out of the realms for this particular impression. Then he has a whip from the Museum of London. I've actually gone to see this one in person, and the replica I got very, very close to the original, thankfully. It's only simple. It's bits of leather wedged and riveted inside a wooden handle. An oxblood belt with silver fittings. Again, oxblood, a very high status color, indicating wealth, indicating that you are someone of note. A set of keys. Again, you have things to open. One of these keys is actually a functional key for my box, which has a lot of the equipment I'm using in it. Things like scales, my vellum for writing on, and a number of other items in there, as well as money, coins, etc. And the last 2 items, we have a wax tablet and stylus. As you can see in his hand, he's essentially writing a note. These were used to write notes. They were used to write something up before you would then take it to a writ or what we call a memoranda, which is a document used to write down notes. We have one from Ely Abbey, where the whole thing is just scribbled in lots of different notes, and he's even drawn a little doodle on the back. And then we have, you can't actually see it in this image, the York axe loop, which is just a piece of leather with 2 slits in the end, wrapped around, and then the axe goes through the center. So yeah, this went on this went on a bit longer than I expected, but I wanted to cover what the impression is before I went over the impression itself. So I hope you enjoyed watching that. I also have a fairly complex living history display along with it that I use at events to show how a high Reeve on the move. High Reeves didn't necessarily travel as much as I would be displaying, although they did travel and they did go to encampments, especially if they're monitoring activities on a wick. But the way we display events in my living history group, we always display a wick or a market or a small settlement. So having an encampment isn't horrendous as a choice, and it allows a lot of freedom for demonstrating this impression. I hope you enjoyed listening to this ramble about my impression and what it is, what it means, where it comes from, and I hope you will enjoy any future content I put out. And if you'd like to subscribe, please do subscribe.